Okay, we are discussing what we're calling the Western story. In fact, you can, if you're viewing this, if you can tell your friends to go to thewesternstory.ca. And the premise we're building on is that Western Canada, Canada West, is a unique region, is a distinctive region. The West is a distinct society, if you like. And it has some unique aspirations. We're talking more about Western aspirations. We're not talking about Western alienation. That's sort of a negative concept. We're talking about the West has particular aspirations. Then if they're not satisfied, the West is not going to be content within the Federation. And one of these aspirations is to see the natural resource sectors, energy, agriculture, mining, forestry, and the fishery, recognized as fundamental building blocks of the economy, not relics from the past, not industries and sectors on their way to oblivion. And we've had discussions of the importance and the role of the energy sector, particularly the petroleum sector and the agricultural sector. But and we want to touch on some of those still. But we particularly want to touch on the importance of the mining sector and the forestry sector and the fishery sector. And these are natural resource sectors that are of particular importance to British Columbia, but they're of importance to the entire Canada West and the entire country. And we're privileged now to talk to David Emerson. David is an economist, I guess, by profession. He has a PhD from Queen's University. He's BC based, but he's had a broad public and private career that makes him an excellent person to talk about this whole natural resources theme. His public career, in fact, I think the first time I met you, David, was when you worked for the government of British Columbia. He was a deputy minister in BC and an advisor to the premier. And then he was a federal cabinet minister. He was, I think, Minister of Trade and then Minister of Industry, which, of course, both portfolios get into this area that we're interested in. His private sector career has included being the CEO of Canfor and a board chair and a board member of numerous companies involved in the resource sector, the transportation sector, and the financial sector. He's been a recipient of many awards, and we won't list them all here, but we are just honored to have the chance to talk to you, David, and thank you for joining us.
Well, it's good to be here, Preston, and look forward to having this discussion.
Okay, well, let's get right into it. I wonder if you could comment on, we're trying to advance this thesis that the natural resource sectors are fundamental building blocks of the economy. And they're a lot bigger and they contribute a lot more to the GDP and to employment and to income than a lot of people think. So can you just sort of reflect on the importance of natural resource sectors, not just to British Columbia, but to Canada West and to the Canadian economy as a whole?
No, I'd be happy to. I think a good way to approach this whole issue of the natural resource economy in Canada is to think in terms of three major forces. The first force economists refer to as the curse of natural resources. And I'll tell you a little bit about what the curse of natural resources means. Most people think of it as countries which have dictator types of government, autocratic governments, and natural resources becomes a tool for kleptocrats to enrich themselves and avoid doing some of the good things in public policy that you can do with natural resources for your population. I'll come back to that because it does have implications for our resource industries here in Canada. And the second dimension that I think is worth noting is the the rural-urban divide has been growing in Canada. Certainly, it's been growing in the United States, and that has profound implications in terms of natural resource industries. And just back to sort of the curse of resources, we don't have a big history of kleptocratic government here in Canada, but what we do have is we have public ownership of resources. And when you have public ownership, the government is basically making fundamental decisions on who can exploit the resources and under what terms. And what we have seen here in Canada, and this is across the provinces, because the provinces essentially control natural resources in Canada. We've got a world in which natural resource policies and the exploitation of natural resources per se are deeply affected by the politics of the particular government. And so you do get situations where, as you develop your natural resources, you're making decisions where you, as the owner of the resource, you as essentially the regulator of the exploitation of the resource, are very close to the companies and organizations that are taking advantage and creating wealth from the natural resource. And that has, certainly in the case of forestry, and I would argue in the case of energy, that's had a great influence on public policy and the way we use natural resources. Here in British Columbia, in the natural resource sectors, and particularly forestry, in the 1980s and 90s, we had a very sympathetic management regime over the forest resource. The result of that was that a lot of our forest practices were not very good. We weren't keeping up to sustained forest management practices. We were leaving some badly scarred parts of the land base and forest base, and that opened the door to environmental activists who then came on the scene and were able to, using not particularly scientific approaches, but using sensational pictures of clear cutting eyesores and so on, to really attack publicly and through the media the governance of our forest sector in BC. And we ended up in those days having to, under pressure from the environmental activists, go not to the regulator of how we were to manage the resources, but to independent certifiers of our forest management practices. And as this played out, the reputation of the forest sector became tarnished very badly, and it was seen by the public because of the activists and media tolerance with largely unscientific approaches by this community. Were able to endlessly portray the forest sector as being badly managed. And eventually, after we were driven to independent certification of our forest practices, the forest industry was able to establish itself and its credibility here in BC. And when you look at the forest sector today, it's really a sector which utilizes high technology. It utilizes space technology. It utilizes genomics as it relates to the land base. It's a highly scientific sector with all kinds of spillovers in terms of building a competitive and sophisticated industrial structure on the forestry side. Something very similar happened with the energy industry in Alberta, where the environmentalists basically were able to attack the management of the natural resource base, the energy base in Alberta, in ways that has has created a very, very tough situation for the energy sector today. And a lot of it is because of this largely unscientific treatment and the communications attacks through the media that have been launched against the fossil fuels industry. But again, the curse of natural resources kind of set us up for that, because in Alberta, those natural resources became a political tool. And rather than do what some countries have done and use those fossil fuel assets for future generations, we set up a heritage fund and then allowed it to be basically frittered away on politically expedient activities instead of the fundamentals of building a long-term stable economic base for the future. So all of that kind of explains how we get to the situation where the public perception of energy and forestry and mining is not very good. There have been activists programs and attacks on the industry, and it has affected natural resources right across the country. The reason that we have such a big problem in the West is because in the West, natural resources are a primary industry. That is our bread and butter for the most part. It's changing slowly, but it's fundamental to our economic well-being.
Well, David, are you saying that part of the strengthening of the resource sectors would actually involve a withdrawal to some extent of the government and the politics from those sectors, that there really has to be less government involvement, less government interference, less political interference? Is that part of the key to strengthening those sectors?
Yeah, I do believe that there is a need, if not the sale of the resource to outside operators and organizations to manage it in a much more long-term beneficial way. I really think that we have got to get those natural resources in such a place where it's not simply bureaucracies and politicians that are making fundamental decisions about the development and exploitation of the resource. Because, I mean, if you look at the forest resource, it's an industry that is renewable, which is good. It's environmentally positive in climate change context. But it's an industry that is very long-term in terms of planning cycles. The growth cycle for trees in BC and to some degree Alberta as well is not a few years, it's like 60 years. And you really need to be making long-term decisions, economic decisions out 100, 200 years. And governments are not particularly good at that. As you know, natural resources tends to be part of the rural economy, if you like. It does permeate into bigger centers and metropolitan areas, but it's particularly important in the hinterland, if you like. The third force that I think we should touch on is the nature of our governance here in Canada. We don't have in Canada a mechanism at the center that allows the interests of regions to influence national policy decisions. We're strictly a representation by population country, and we don't do that very well. We're constantly behind in terms of allocating parliamentary seats. Our Senate is basically powerless. And so you've got to look at, I think, how those three forces converge. And then I'll come back and talk a little bit about how how rich the natural resources sectors are in terms of employment opportunities, in terms of technology, in terms of really allowing Canada to have a competitive leg up in the global economy.
These resource sectors are in the rural part of the country. And in Canada now, I think the so-called rural population is about 18% of the total population. So over 80% of our people are in urban areas. But so to get a government to move on something pertaining to the resource sectors, you've got to persuade 4 people or 5 people in the cities that in order to get the votes to do something, you got to persuade a bunch of people in the urban areas that these sectors that are basically rural based have particular needs and should be addressed. How do you persuade the urban resident or voter of the importance of these resource sectors that are out in the country? When that person, they don't visit a farm, they don't visit a mine, they don't visit the forest, but that bridging that gap is fundamentally important to getting any progress on these resource policies.
And he's often seen as a zero sum, right? The environment or development.
Yeah. Well, I guess a couple of comments. One, with COVID, there has been a new normal emerging. Whether it will be lasting and growing or not, I don't know, where people are moving to smaller communities. And when you look in BC at where people are moving to and from, they're moving from Vancouver and the Vancouver area to the smaller centers up the valley in the interior and so on. So there may be a minor amount of rebalancing of the rural-urban divide in that sense. But I think it's also important. A lot of the folks, the activists, the political parties that have brought in regulations and initiatives that have been unfavorable to resource industries are the same people who want to make sure that Indigenous Canadians are given opportunities to get into the economic mainstream in Canada. And I got to tell you, nearly half of the Indigenous population in Canada is still living in rural and remote areas. And the only way to really bring them into the economic mainstream, in my view, is through the natural resource industries and encouraging their participation, their employment, their creation of companies in the natural resource industries. And so you cannot solve the Indigenous problem without getting some significant good quality employment opportunities and wealth creation opportunities into rural areas. I'm on the board of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, and there's a lot of Canadians who love to hate the Trans Mountain Pipeline. And many of the same people that love to hate the pipeline don't realize that something like $2.7 billion in economic opportunities are going to Aboriginal companies or joint ventures and partnerships with Aboriginal communities, and over 10% of the workforce is Indigenous on the pipeline, and there are probably 40 or so communities in the rural parts of BC along the pipeline corridor who are going to get access to high-speed internet as a result of the pipeline and the partnership with Rogers on providing high-speed internet that originally was to serve the pipeline. And so there is, I think, huge opportunities if we can show people what the opportunities are like, show them the kind of technology, the sophistication of the jobs that are in the resource industries or relate to the resource industries. Huge opportunities, and I think that will help.
We could spend a lot of time on this, and you've been very informative on this, but one question we want to end up on, and I've been asking this to all of our guests. I I worry about our Canadian tendency to discuss things ad infinitum, to blog on them and tweet on them and have conferences on them, but doing something is in another category. And if there's people who've been listening to you and viewing you and who maybe agree with a lot of what you've said, what can they do in order to move things in the several directions that you've mentioned? What practical things can people do to recognize this importance of the resource sectors you've referred to, and to get better treatment for them going forward? What can they do?
Well, I believe that if people do their homework, research the industries, if they think an industry is not performing or behaving in a socially positive way, get in and dig into the facts and the fact base. And when you hear campaigns and activists are banging on your door wanting money, force a discussion about the facts, because the facts are often victims to some of these campaigns, because it allows fundraising to be done more successfully, but on the basis of a distorted view of reality, and convincing people wrongly to make sacrifices that will hurt the future of the country, the future of the kids and our grandkids. And so I'm a great believer that you got to go into the internet and use it to learn and to verify, and don't accept what anybody is saying that isn't authenticatable and verifiable, because there is such sophistication out there right now in terms of spreading distortions and untruths that you just got to fight back, and there is no substitute for due diligence and digging into it.
So inform yourself. Inform yourself is something some people can do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, thank you very much, David. We appreciate this. We're going to roll this interview in with several others on the same subject, but you've provided a somewhat different perspective and a very helpful one. So we want to thank you for doing this.
Thanks, David.
Okay, thanks, guys.
Okay.